Copy. He loaded the .44, then said just 5 words. The bank was already bleeding when Harry Callahan got there. Not metaphorically. The floor was slick with it, a thick, dark smear running from the teller windows all the way to the revolving door, where a security guard had tried, one last time, to be a hero. He hadn't made it. Nobody ever did when Scorpio was involved. The dispatch call had come through at 7:41 in the morning, which meant Harry had been awake for exactly 36 hours, running on black coffee and the kind of quiet fury that only sharpens with time. He stepped over the glass. He stepped over the guard. He moved through that lobby the way he always moved, slowly, deliberately, like a man who already knew how the story ended and was simply walking toward the last page. 3 squad cars were parked outside. 11 officers were standing behind them. None of them had gone in. Harry had gone in alone. That was the difference between Harry Callahan and every other badge in San Francisco. They waited for the situation to develop. Harry walked into the situation and made it develop on his terms. And on this particular morning, in this particular bank, with blood still wet on the marble floor and a hostage crying somewhere behind the vault door, Harry Callahan reached into his holster, wrapped his fingers around the grip of his Smith & Wesson Model 29, and he began to load it. 1 round. 2 rounds. 3. 4. 5. 6. The cylinder snapped shut with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. Then he said just 5 words. And those 5 words, quiet, flat, utterly without drama, changed everything that happened next. But to understand why those 5 words landed the way they did, you have to understand who Harry Callahan was before he became the legend. You have to understand what San Francisco did to him. What the system did to him. What the streets gave him that no police academy ever could. Because Harry Callahan wasn't born brutal. He was made that way. And the city that made him was both the most beautiful and the most rotten place in America. San Francisco in the early 1970s was a city at war with itself. The Summer of Love was already a ghost story, something people talked about with a kind of nostalgic ache, as though the city had briefly touched something holy and then watched it dissolve in the rain. What replaced it wasn't peace. What replaced it was a particular kind of urban desperation. The desperation of a place that had promised everything and delivered something much darker. The Zodiac Killer had spent years terrorizing the Bay Area, taunting the police with ciphers and letters, and the department had been humiliated, outmaneuvered, made to look slow and bureaucratic while a killer turned murder into theater. The counterculture had curdled. The neighborhoods that had once hummed with idealism were now running on something harder and colder. Crime wasn't climbing. Crime was detonating. And the city's response, the official, institutional, by-the-book response, was exactly the kind of measured, procedurally cautious, legally squeamish non-response that makes a man like Harry Callahan grind his teeth until something threatens to crack. Harry had been on the force long enough to know how the machinery worked. He'd watched it work. He'd watched good cases fall apart because a judge decided the evidence had been obtained improperly. He'd watched violent offenders walk out of courtrooms while the families of their victims sat in the gallery and tried to understand what justice was supposed to mean. He'd filed the paperwork. He'd followed the protocols. He'd done it the right way, and the right way kept producing wrong results, and at some point Harry Callahan made a decision that defined everything that came after. He decided that the law was a tool, and like any tool, it could be used correctly or it could be used badly, and when the people who were supposed to use it correctly kept fumbling it, kept dropping it, kept looking the other way when it mattered most, then a man with different priorities had to step in. That man was him. And that decision cost him more than he ever admitted to anyone. The file on Harry Callahan, the internal one, the one that department brass passed around and discussed in hushed, worried tones, read like a catalog of everything you weren't supposed to do and still survive. He'd been shot. Multiple times. He'd been beaten. He'd been blown up. He'd had his career threatened, his cases thrown out, his methods questioned in formal hearings where men in expensive suits explained to him, with enormous condescension, that he was an embarrassment to the institution. He'd heard all of it. He'd sat in those hearings with his jaw set and his eyes flat and his hands very still on his thighs, and when it was his turn to speak, he'd said approximately as much as he felt like saying, which was never very much, and then he'd gone back to work. Because the thing about Harry Callahan, the thing that his enemies misunderstood and his few allies understood completely, was that he genuinely did not care what happened to Harry Callahan. He cared about the city. He cared about the people in it who couldn't protect themselves. He cared about the woman working the night shift at the diner who walked home alone because she couldn't afford a cab. He cared about the kid on the corner who was 3 bad decisions away from either being a statistic or becoming the thing that created statistics. He cared in a way that had nothing to do with sentimentality and everything to do with a bone-deep conviction that someone had to stand between the wolves and everyone else, and since nobody else seemed willing to do it, that someone was him. The city gave him nothing in return for this. The city took from him. It took his wife, killed by a drunk driver who was out on bail for the 3rd time, and the drunk driver had gotten 4 years and served 2, and Harry had stood outside the courtroom afterwards and looked at the sky and said nothing at all and then gone back to work. The city took his faith in the institution. It took his patience. It took the part of him that believed things could be fixed gently, carefully, within the lines. What it left was something purer and more dangerous. A man who had stripped away every illusion and was operating on nothing but raw conviction and extraordinary skill. And an extraordinarily large handgun. The Smith & Wesson Model 29.44 Magnum is not a subtle weapon. It is not a weapon for someone who wants to keep their options open, who wants to de-escalate, who wants to create space for dialogue. It is, as Harry himself said on at least one memorable occasion, the most powerful handgun in the world. It fires a cartridge that was originally designed for hunting, for stopping things considerably larger and more dangerous than human beings, and when Harry Callahan chose it as his service weapon, over department objections, over the recommendations of his supervisors, over the puzzled stares of colleagues who carried standard-issue revolvers and thought he was either compensating for something or genuinely insane, he was making a statement. The statement was this: whatever comes through that door, whatever crawls out of whatever dark corner this city produces, I am prepared to end it. Not slow it down. Not wound it. Not issue a warning. End it. There is something philosophically significant about that choice. A lot of people have written about it, analyzed it, turned it into a metaphor for excess or fascism or vigilantism, and they're not entirely wrong, those threads are genuinely there. But they miss something. The 44 Magnum wasn't just about stopping power. It was about certainty. Harry Callahan had been robbed of certainty by the system. The courts were uncertain. The laws were uncertain. The outcomes of doing things correctly were deeply, painfully uncertain. The gun was not uncertain. In a world that had failed him through its ambiguity, Harry found his clarity in something simple and irreversible. Point. Squeeze. Done. That's not a philosophy anyone should be entirely comfortable with. But it's one that made a terrifying kind of sense in the San Francisco of that era, and the reason audiences responded to it, and still respond to it, is that the discomfort it produces is real and complicated, not simple. Scorpio was the purest expression of everything Harry was fighting. Not because Scorpio was uniquely clever, though he was, and not because Scorpio was uniquely violent, though he was that too. Scorpio was the thing that the city's liberalism couldn't quite process. A killer who used the machinery of rights and protections as a weapon. He knew what he was doing when he made demands. He knew how the legal system worked well enough to exploit it. He understood that a search obtained without proper warrant would get thrown out, that statements made without proper advisement could be challenged, that a charismatic attorney and a sympathetic judge could turn procedure into escape. He was, in the most disturbing possible sense, a student of the system. Not a rebel against it, but a parasite within it. And this is what drove Harry to the edge that everyone around him could see him approaching and nobody could talk him back from. Because Harry had worked within the system. He had watched the system fail. He had watched it fail specifically in the Scorpio case, watched a killer walk because of a procedural error, watched the families of victims absorb that blow with the particular stunned silence of people who have just discovered that justice is not actually inevitable. And Harry made a decision. He made the decision that the mechanism of law was less important than the outcome it was supposed to produce, and that when the mechanism and the outcome came into conflict, a man of genuine conviction chose the outcome. This is where the philosophy gets genuinely uncomfortable. This is where Harry Callahan stops being a simple action hero and becomes something that a just society should find at least a little threatening. Because the logic he's following is not absurd. The logic is internally coherent. And that's exactly the problem. The road from, "the system failed so I had to act," to something much darker is shorter than anyone wants to believe, and Harry Callahan was walking it every day, and the only thing that kept him from going all the way down was whatever was left of the man underneath the legend. That man, the one underneath, is the one that most of the surface-level analysis of the Dirty Harry films misses entirely. Harry Callahan was lonely in a way that had become structural. It had stopped being a feeling and started being an architecture. He had no meaningful relationships with other officers because he operated in ways that frightened them. He had no meaningful relationships with civilians because what he knew about the city would make ordinary life feel like a lie. He had had a wife, and the city had taken her, and he had processed that loss by doing what Harry Callahan always did with things that hurt. He buried it under work, under the job, under the relentless forward motion of a man who stopped if nothing. There is a scene, not the famous one, but one that happens quietly, almost in the margins of the film, where Harry is alone in his apartment. The apartment is spare. Almost empty. There are no photographs visible. There is a television that seems like it's on mostly for noise. There is a half-eaten meal on a table that was clearly designed for two people and is clearly only ever used by one. And Harry sits in it the way he sits in the interrogation room and the way he stands on the street, present, alert, watching something that nobody else can see. That image is more disturbing than anything Scorpio does in the film. Because Scorpio is a monster, and monsters are comprehensible. You understand what they are and why they exist. But Harry sitting alone in that apartment, surrounded by the absence of everything the job took from him, is something sadder and more human and more difficult to categorize. He made a choice. He chose the streets over everything else. And the streets gave him victory after victory, and each victory cost him something he couldn't name and couldn't get back, and at some point the victories and the losses started to feel like the same thing. The rooftop scene. The night game. The stadium under the lights. If you know the Dirty Harry films, you know what we're talking about. If you don't, here is what you need to understand. It is the scene that defines Harry Callahan not as a cop but as an idea. Scorpio had taken a hostage. He had issued demands. He had done exactly what he always did. Turned the city's better instincts against itself, used the threat of innocent suffering to buy himself leverage, forced the machinery of official response into its own grinding paralysis. And Harry, who had been told to stand down, who had been explicitly ordered by his lieutenant and by the mayor's office to let the negotiators handle it, who had every institutional reason to stay on the sideline, Harry went in alone. What followed was not elegant. It was not tactically brilliant in the way that action movies usually celebrate. It was brutally, almost grimly effective. Harry found him. Harry got on top of him. Harry planted his knee in the wound he'd created and leaned on it and asked him where the girl was. Not asked. Demanded. In a voice that had no procedural courtesy in it whatsoever, in a way that would have made any lawyer in the country start calculating the appellate arguments. And Scorpio told him. And they found the girl. And she was already dead. And Harry stood there with the information he'd extracted through methods that any court in the land would call torture, and he had nothing to show for it except the knowledge that Scorpio would walk again, and that the girl was gone, and that the only clean thing in the whole transaction was the choice he'd made going in. He chose the outcome over the mechanism. The mechanism had already failed the girl. He made the only choice left. And it still wasn't enough. This is not a triumphant story. This is a story about what happens when a good man decides that the rules are the enemy of justice, and the tragedy is not that he's entirely wrong. You cannot talk about Harry Callahan without talking about San Francisco itself as a character, and you cannot talk about San Francisco as a character without talking about what it means to love a city and hate what it's become. Harry loved San Francisco. This is not stated explicitly in the films. Harry states almost nothing explicitly, but it is in everything he does. He patrols streets he doesn't have to patrol. He knows corners and alleys by name. He knows the faces of the people who live in the neighborhoods, the ones who wave and the ones who don't, the ones who've seen things they'll never report and the ones who'll call the moment they see something wrong. He has a relationship with the city that is almost intimate, the relationship of a man who has spent so much time in a place that it has become part of how he thinks, part of the geography of his mind. And he is watching that city be consumed. He is watching the streets become something that the people who live on them are afraid of. He is watching the gap between what the city promised to be and what it actually is grow wider every year, and nobody in an official capacity seems to be in any hurry to close it. The politics of the era, the civil liberties debates, the genuine and important arguments about police brutality and due process and the rights of the accused, Harry doesn't dismiss these. He can't. He's a cop. He knows what bad policing looks like. He's seen it. He's been sickened by it. But he's also standing in the middle of the consequences of a system that lurched too far in the other direction, that became so preoccupied with protecting the mechanisms of justice that it lost track of its purpose, and he is the human cost of that imbalance. He is what happens when the gap between law and justice gets wide enough that a person of conscience has to choose between them. That choice destroys him slowly. And he makes it every day. The question of whether Harry Callahan is a hero is one that the films themselves refuse to answer, and that refusal is the most honest thing about them. The easy reading is that he's a fantasy, the strong man who cuts through the red tape and gives the bad guys what they deserve, a wish-fulfillment figure for everyone who's ever felt betrayed by institutional failure. This reading is not wrong. There is absolutely a wish-fulfillment element. But the films are too honest to let it be only that. They keep showing you the cost. They keep putting Harry in situations where his methods work and still leave him with nothing. The girl in the stadium scene. The partner who dies. The captain who looks at him with something between respect and despair. The final image of the badge. These are not the images of a man who won. These are the images of a man who kept fighting after winning became impossible, because stopping was the one thing he couldn't do. There's a version of Harry Callahan's story that ends happily, where the system gets cleaned up, where the right people get convicted, where the city becomes what it was supposed to be and Harry gets to hang up the .44 and sit somewhere quiet and feel like it was worth it. That story doesn't exist. The story that exists is darker and truer. The city grinds on, the bad guys keep coming, and Harry keeps walking toward them, and the only question is how many more pieces of himself he can afford to leave on the street. The answer, based on everything we see, is all of them. Harry Callahan will give all of it. He already has. And he would do it again tomorrow. The detective who inspired a generation of imitators and no real successors understood something about the relationship between violence and meaning that most people spend their whole lives avoiding. Violence, in Harry's world, is not glamorous. It is not exciting in the Hollywood sense. It is a last resort that has become a first resort because all the intermediary options failed, and it carries weight in direct proportion to the failures that preceded it. When Harry points the .44 at someone, the gun is not just a gun. It is the accumulated weight of every courtroom that let a killer go, every procedural dismissal, every bureaucratic obstruction, every moment where the system chose its own protection over the protection of the people it was supposed to serve. The gun is what happens at the end of a very long argument. And the 5 words he says when he pulls the trigger, or sometimes doesn't pull it, which is its own kind of statement, those words are not bravado. They are the final punctuation on a sentence the system should have finished years ago. That's what makes them land. That's what makes them echo. You don't respond to those 5 words because they're cool, though they are. You respond to them because somewhere in you, you recognize the argument behind them. You know what it took to get to that moment. You know everything that failed before Harry became necessary. And you feel, in that instant, the complicated and uncomfortable satisfaction of watching someone act with total conviction in a world that rewards doubt and punishes certainty. It's not safe. It's not comfortable. But it is, in the most stripped-down possible sense, honest. Harry Callahan's world was San Francisco, but his story is every city that ever looked at its own institutions and found them wanting. Every city that produced a cop who cared too much and burned out because caring too much in a broken system doesn't produce results, it produces casualties. Every city where the gap between the law as written and justice as experienced grew wide enough that someone fell through it. Harry didn't fall. He jumped. He looked at the gap and decided that the fall was worth it if he landed on the right side, and he jumped, and he has been falling ever since. Or flying, depending on how you look at it, and the city watches him go and doesn't quite know whether to cheer or cry. Both, probably. Both at the same time. The films understood this. Clint Eastwood understood this. Don Siegel, who directed the first film and set the template for everything that followed, understood that what he was making was not an action movie in the simple sense but a tragedy in the classical sense. A story about a man of enormous virtue and enormous flaw, and about how those two things are, in Harry's case, the same thing. The virtue is the flaw. The absolute commitment to justice is what makes him dangerous. The willingness to sacrifice everything including his own legal standing and his own safety and his own future is what makes him heroic and what makes him a cautionary figure simultaneously. That's not easy to do in a genre film. It's genuinely hard. And the fact that they pulled it off, that Harry Callahan exists as a real character and not just a badass archetype, is why we're still talking about him 50 years later. The badge. Let's talk about the badge. At the end of the first film, Harry throws his badge into the quarry. He has just killed Scorpio. He has done it in a way that made the case legally worthless, that shredded every procedural protection, that gave every civil libertarian in the country exactly the nightmare scenario they'd been warning about. He did it anyway. He did it because Scorpio was going to kill again and the system had already proven that it couldn't stop him, and Harry made the calculation that a dead Scorpio was worth more than a legally obtained Scorpio, and he may have been right about that, and it doesn't matter whether he was right, because the point is the badge at the end. He doesn't walk away triumphant. He doesn't walk away at all in the simple sense. He throws the badge because he knows what he just did, and he knows that the institution he just violated is the same institution that he served for his entire career and that gave shape to his life and that he genuinely believed in, once, before everything happened. The badge going into the water is an act of honesty. It's Harry saying, I can't pretend this is what that badge is supposed to stand for. I can't carry this symbol of lawful process while I am the man who just did what I just did. I have to be honest about what I am. And what I am is someone who chose outcome over process, and those two things can't live in the same body anymore. It's an act of enormous integrity from a man who just committed an act that integrity cannot entirely cover. The contradiction is the point. Harry Callahan is the contradiction. That's why he lasts. The imitators came. They always do. After Dirty Harry opened and became the cultural phenomenon that nobody entirely predicted, every studio in Hollywood wanted their version. Tough cop, big gun, doesn't play by the rules. The formula seemed simple. The execution always missed something. What it missed was the tragedy. What it missed was the cost. The knockoffs made their heroes invulnerable, not just physically but morally, emotionally, philosophically. They never had to make the choice that Harry makes. They never had to sit with what the choice cost them. They had the gun and the attitude and the one-liners, and they were missing the interior life that makes those things mean something. Harry Callahan is not cool in the way that action heroes are usually cool, effortlessly, costlessly, without visible consequence. Harry is cool in the way that a man is cool when he has stripped away everything unnecessary and is operating on pure essential function. There is no performance in it. There is nothing left to perform. That quality, the quality of someone who has been reduced to their core and found that their core can take it, is extraordinarily rare in fiction, and extraordinarily rare in real life, and when you encounter it you recognize it immediately even if you can't name what you're responding to. You're responding to authenticity in its most extreme form. A man who has nothing left to hide because there's nothing left to hide behind. That's Harry. And that's why the imitations failed. They were all surface. Harry is all depth. The surface is almost incidental. The moment in the bank, the one we started with, the one that this whole story is built around, happened the way it happened because Harry Callahan had already decided, years before that morning, what kind of man he was going to be. The decision had been made slowly, incrementally, through 1,000 small moments that each took something and gave something back that was slightly different in shape. The decision had been made final by his wife's death and by the courtroom that followed and by every case that had collapsed afterward and by every night in that empty apartment with the television on for noise. By the time he walked into that bank, the decision was just a fact about him. Like his height. Like the color of his eyes. He was the man who walked into the situation when everyone else stood outside. He was the man who loaded the cylinder with 6 rounds and snapped it shut and said 5 words. The 5 words that changed everything. You already know what those 5 words were. You knew before we started. You knew because they have been ringing in the cultural atmosphere for 50 years, passed from one generation to the next like a piece of folklore or a catechism. You know them because they are one of the few pieces of movie dialogue that transcends the movie they came from and becomes part of the language itself, part of the way we talk about moments of reckoning and irrevocable commitment. You know them because something in them is true. Not morally true, necessarily. Not true in the sense that we should all be doing what Harry does. True in the sense that they named something real about how human beings are built, about the place in all of us that wants to know whether we are, when it comes down to it, lucky enough, or brave enough, or desperate enough, or committed enough, to bet everything on a single moment. The answer Harry Callahan gives to that question, every single time, without hesitation, without performance, looking straight into whatever is in front of him with those flat and certain eyes, is the only answer that has ever come from a place of complete conviction. It's the answer of a man who has already calculated the odds, already accepted every possible outcome, already made his peace with all of it, and is simply waiting for the universe to catch up. Do you feel lucky? The gun is already loaded. The cylinder is already turning. And Harry Callahan is already walking toward you. He has been walking toward you his whole life. This is where he was always going. The weight of what he carried went largely unacknowledged by the institution he served. This is worth dwelling on. The department that benefited from Harry's results, the closed cases, the removed threats, the streets made temporarily safer by his willingness to go places nobody else would go. That same department spent considerable energy distancing itself from his methods. They needed the outcomes but couldn't endorse the process. They used him the way a city uses its most damaged infrastructure, they relied on it completely while it held, and they prepared their disclaimers for when it didn't. Harry knew this. He was not naive. He understood his position in the machine. The piece that made other pieces work by absorbing the friction they couldn't handle, by doing the things that needed to be done in a way that gave everyone else plausible distance. He understood that the lieutenant who yelled at him in the office and the mayor who called him an embarrassment and the captains who opened their mouths to express outrage all went home that night to cities where Harry Callahan had made something slightly safer, slightly more livable, by being exactly the thing they were publicly appalled by. He understood the hypocrisy completely. He never called it out, because calling it out would have required a kind of investment in the institution that he no longer had. He just did the job. He let them have their denials. He walked back out onto the street and kept going. That capacity, to do what needs to be done without needing recognition for it, without needing the institution to acknowledge what it's actually taking from you, is something that very few people are built for. Most people need the transaction to be acknowledged. Harry didn't. That was either his greatest strength or his greatest wound, and probably it was both, and probably they were the same thing. Let's return to the streets. Let's return to San Francisco at the moment Harry Callahan inhabited it most completely, at night, in rain, in the particular darkness of a city that never sleeps but often hides. The streets were his. Not in a territorial sense. Not in the sense of ownership or control. In the sense that they were legible to him in a way they weren't to anyone else. He could read a block the way a navigator reads a coastline, not by the landmarks in the travel guides but by the small irregularities, the things that shouldn't be where they are, the car parked at the wrong angle, the light on in the window at the wrong hour, the quiet that is a different kind of quiet from ordinary quiet. He had built this literacy over decades, adding to it constantly, and it gave him a relationship with the city that was almost oracular. He seemed to know where the trouble was going to be before it was there, seemed to move through the geography with a foreknowledge that his colleagues found unnerving and his superiors found convenient. He was not psychic. He was simply paying a kind of attention that most people couldn't sustain, that would exhaust most people within weeks, that Harry Callahan had been sustaining for 20 years because it was the only way he knew to live in the world. Total vigilance as a substitute for peace. Total presence as an alternative to having something to go home to. He was always on the street because the street was all he had, and because he genuinely believed that his presence on it meant something. Meant that there was one more chance that the woman walking home alone made it, that the kid on the corner got one more day before the bad decision, that the city's worst impulses found at least one person in their way. This belief was what sustained him. Not cynicism, something closer to its opposite. Harry Callahan, underneath everything, was an idealist. He just expressed his idealism through a .44 Magnum and a willingness to absorb whatever the city threw at him. Which is an unusual form of idealism. But there it is. What the camera captured in the first film, what Don Siegel understood about Eastwood and what Eastwood understood about himself, was that stillness. The stillness of a man who is completely ready. Not tense, because tension implies uncertainty, and Harry had processed his uncertainty years ago. Just ready. The way a loaded weapon is ready. Not threatening, exactly, though the threat is obviously present. Simply existing in a state of complete preparation, so that the distance between stillness and action is essentially zero, so that when the moment comes there is no gap between decision and execution because the decision was already made. This quality is deeply unnerving in a human being. We expect people to have hesitation, to have the visible flutter of something being weighed and considered, to show us the process of arriving at a choice. Harry shows nothing. The choice has already been made. The process happened somewhere private, somewhere years ago, somewhere we are not allowed to follow, and what emerged from it is this: a man standing very still in a bank lobby while everyone else runs, holding a very large gun, absolutely certain of what comes next. 5 words. Just 5 words. And the whole city shifts on its axis. The legacy of Harry Callahan is more complicated than the image. The image is what stuck, the squint, the gun, the line. But the legacy, the real legacy, is the question he forced people to ask and couldn't stop forcing them to ask. What do you do when the system designed to produce justice produces injustice instead? What is your obligation? What is the cost of inaction versus the cost of action taken outside the lines? These are not small questions. They are not questions that have clean answers. And the reason Harry Callahan is still with us, still being discussed, still generating argument and analysis and reverence and critique, is that the questions he embodies haven't been answered. They can't be answered in the abstract. They can only be lived, answered in specific situations by specific people with specific histories, in the moment when the choice becomes unavoidable. Harry Callahan lived through that moment more times than any one person should have to. He answered it the same way each time. Not because he was certain he was right. Because he couldn't live with the alternative. There is something in that, in the willingness to absorb the cost of your convictions, in the refusal to protect yourself from the consequences of what you believe, that commands a kind of respect that has nothing to do with whether you agree with the convictions themselves. You can think Harry Callahan is wrong. You probably should, on some level, think Harry Callahan is wrong. But you cannot think he is dishonest. And in the San Francisco of the early 1970s, in the city of the Zodiac and the curdled summer of love and the grinding machinery of a system consuming itself, honesty was rarer than justice. Harry had both. He just had them in a form that was hard to live next to and impossible to dismiss. The bank floor was slick. The guard was down. The doors were still turning. And Harry Callahan walked in alone, loaded 6 rounds into the cylinder, and said just 5 words. The rest of the city is still catching up. And somewhere out there, in a city that looks different but feels exactly the same, a city where the courts still fumble and the system still grinds and the streets still produce things that the official response is too slow and too cautious to stop, there is a man loading a cylinder. 6 rounds. Snap. He looks up. His eyes are flat. His hands are completely still. And he is already walking toward whatever it is, because that is what he does, because that is all he has ever done, because there was never any other version of him that survived the city long enough to matter. Harry Callahan is not a relic. He is a mirror. And what he reflects back is the question we are still not ready to answer honestly: when everything else fails, who are you willing to be?